I'm so pleased to have a teacher who is really fascinated. She does a lot of research, although she is more into the religious studies. But Kelly has been in our teacher training program, and she has been to India. She has attended numerous teacher or pedagogical and curricular development, mostly to teach religious studies in high school and middle school. And she's very passionate about doing research and making sure that students get good understanding of religious studies in the classroom without being offended. And she has developed some of the strategies for the teaching religion in classroom, and some of the discussion we have had. And Kelly has been actually listening through even the Hindi presentations, and she told me she understood every one of them. No, she really wants to make sure that she wants to listen to again, because some of the things she had questions actually we forgot to ask if she had any questions because she was on. So she's going to talk about content knowledge and instructional strategies in teaching religion in classroom. And Kelly, you are on. She's from Western Middle in a school for the arts in Kentucky. Kelly, can you hear us? No, we cannot hear you. Can you do that? We can hear a little bit, but not. Okay, now can you say something?
Hello,
Yeah,
I'm Kelly.
yes. Okay, great. Thanks, Kelly, for joining us.
You're welcome. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Is that all right?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm so excited to be a part of this and to share what I have learned. I'm going to begin, like many religious studies scholars, I prefer to begin by sharing my personal and professional context. Since invariably these contexts are going to influence the content of my presentation today. I'm here to speak as a student, a scholar, and an educator of religion. Although I no longer consider myself, quote-unquote, religious, my interest in religious topics spans nearly my entire lifetime. As a kid, I often read stories about Roman Catholic saints and their miracles. In high school, I participated in youth groups and that often discussed church catechism and doctrine. Yet in college, which I started the year after the 9/11 attacks, I focused my studies mostly on non-Western religious identities because I wanted to understand viewpoints that I was raised to think were wrong, inferior, or a career in K-12 education is the unintentional yet direct result of a calling to pursue the academic study of religion. As part of my graduate program, I led an introductory world religions course for 2 semesters. There I found my love for teaching people how to understand others. As a result, I abandoned the ivory tower and committed myself to a field, K-12 education, that refuses to ignore how important public scholarship is to the well-being of society. Through a series of events, divine and or coincidental, I am now in a school environment that allows me to channel my passion for learning about religion into teaching underserved populations. Perhaps more than anyone, these students deserve to learn, by right of their humanity and their oppression, how to understand themselves and others. Through my work with the Religious Freedom Center, I gained an even deeper understanding of the responsibility citizens have to protect each other's civil rights and liberties, and not just our own. As a teacher, I believe I had a unique and specific responsibility to protect my students' rights to a quality education, one that includes religious literacy. So, unfortunately, in my experience, it is uncommon to find teachers who think they have adequate training to teach about religion in K-12 public schools. I'm going to turn the video off so that you can see my full screen. work. I know teachers who feel adequately trained to teach about religion in a liberal arts university, not to younger students with lower reading, writing, and critical thinking conditions, nor in communities with polarized religious views. An even broader challenge is the general lack of awareness that K-12 educators have about religious studies scholarship. Many educators I have encountered misunderstand the role and function of religious studies as an academic field, if they know anything about it at all. Before we can improve religious literacy, we have to convince educators that religious literacy is something they should want, and perhaps they do not yet have. Similarly, many educators are unfamiliar with constitutional law, and more specifically, the Supreme Court's stance on teaching about religion in public schools. The prevailing assumption is that it is not permissible to teach about certain religious texts or rituals in a public school setting, even though the Supreme Court has consistently supported teaching about religion. In order to convince educators on a wider scale that the academic study of religion is a distinct and valuable field of inquiry that has a place in K-12 classrooms, we need clear pedagogical frameworks and education initiatives to support teachers of religious literacy. When designing their lessons, K-12 teachers often begin planning instruction by asking themselves 3 questions. What do we want students to learn? What do we want students to do? How will we know they have mastered this content and skill? We use these questions to guide our instruction in order to ensure we regularly and consistently measure student growth in both content knowledge and the development of social and critical thinking skills. In reality, however, educators do not always configure the balance between knowledge and skills the same way. Some education reformers, such as John Dewey, advocates a skills-based strategy to learning instead of what he describes as the piling up of information that results from content-based learning. It's not enough for students to know information, especially in the age of information technology. Students also need to know how to measure the reliability of information, corroborate sources, and situate facts within their geographical, historical, and social contexts. Others, like E.D. Hirsch, criticize the skills-based approach because it fails to nourish our cultural memory with core knowledge. In turn, they argue the skills-based approach has produced a gradual decline in our ability to communicate. Somewhat ironically, the overemphasis of skills results in underdevelopment and deficiency in social and critical thinking skills, rather than growth and mastery, because it fails to provide students with the essential information needed to perform these skills. Finding a balance between content and skills is particularly critical in the academic study of religion because religious illiteracy imperils our public life, as Stephen Prothero writes, by disempowering citizens of their intellectual sovereignty. Without religious literacy, we must depend on so-called experts to articulate the meaning and expression of religious identity. What then is the most effective way to liberate students from both their ignorance of and dependency on others when it comes to learning about religion? For Stephen Prothero, a professor of religion at Boston University and author of the book Religious Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know and Doesn't, educators have a civic responsibility to combat religious illiteracy. They accomplish this by teaching students how to understand and use the religious terms, symbols, images, beliefs, practices, scriptures, heroes, themes, and stories that are employed in American public life. In his view, basic knowledge about the quote-unquote building blocks of religious traditions enables students to participate in conversations about public and private religion. It also helps citizens participate fully in social, political, and economic life, especially in a nation and in a world in which religion counts. By teaching about the fundamental differences among religious traditions, he argues, teachers equip students with the tools necessary to maneuver successfully and independently in a world where religion influences elections, armies, and markets. To be functional members of our globalized community, students must learn about religious worlds outside their own. While Diane Moore, who's director of the Religious Literacy Project at Harvard University, agrees with Prothero over the urgent importance of improving religious literacy of students, she questions the efficacy of classroom instruction that emphasizes knowledge acquisition over skills performance. Rather than uncritically memorizing a pre-selected set of religious data, such as sacred texts, key beliefs and rituals, founders, geographic origins, Moore's cultural studies approach teaches students how to situate religious materials in their specific social and historical contexts. By requiring students to demonstrate both content knowledge and inquiry skills, Moore attempts to resolve the problems created by Prothero's method, which tends to reify religious traditions and often, though unintentionally, reinforces ahistorical, sectarian, and even hegemonic worldviews. The building blocks of religious traditions are not uniform nor ubiquitous across communities, and to examine them as such misleads students into thinking that religions are not diverse, dynamic, and culturally embedded. Although Moore's cultural studies approach addresses some problems created by Prothero's phenomenological approach to teaching about religion, Benjamin Marcus, who is the education specialist at the Religious Freedom Center, points out that Moore's approach carries its own limitations and offers a solution. While Moore's approach teaches students to think more critically about the religious subjects they study, the Marcus approach more effectively negotiates the balance of skills and content by teaching students how to develop an insider perspective in order to understand the meanings of these subjects more profoundly. The goal of the Marcus method is not simply to know about the building blocks, as is the Prothero method, or to understand their origins and development over time, as is the Moore method. Marcus argues that classrooms must also enable students to understand how and why individuals and communities use these building blocks to construct their religious identities. According to Marcus's 6-point framework, religion is a diverse, dynamic, and culturally embedded blend of transcendent beliefs, behaviors, and experiences of belonging. This particular framework is especially appropriate for K-12 public schools because it provides clear interpretive categories that are not too abstract for students with limited background knowledge. Unlike other frameworks for thinking about religious identity, such as Ninian Smart's 7 Dimensions of Religion or Clifford Geertz's 5-part definition for religion, the 6-point framework provides K-12 students a concrete method for thinking about religion that does not require a sophisticated understanding of social scientific analytical trends over the past 200 years. Indeed, most children will likely struggle to articulate the differences among common sense, scientific, and religious perspectives in societies, or between the philosophical and ethical dimensions of religion, because they are still developing their abilities to think critically and abstractly. As long as I have taught middle school, I've struggled unsuccessfully to find a way to translate my training in religious studies into classroom instruction. Usually I end up talking over my students' heads by assigning readings that are too complex for their abilities, or boring them with lectures about people, places, and concepts about which they know nothing and share no personal connection. Developmentally, middle school students need to relate and connect with the content on a personal level in order for learning to occur. Most of my students have not yet developed the more objective academic curiosity we see in older high school students and undergraduate students. More specifically, what separates middle and high school students in particular is their ability to communicate their familiarity with these concepts. When asked to explain their reasoning, my students sometimes respond, "I don't know, I just know." I used to become frustrated with this answer, seeing it as more of a cop-out than a legitimate response. But now I understand this answer to mean, I don't know how to communicate my reasoning, yet I am confident in my comprehension of these ideas. Although students lack the linguistic tools necessary to communicate their ideas effectively, they do not lack ideas. Thus, the 6-point framework provides middle school teachers starting points for helping kids to develop stronger analytical and communication skills. Additionally, the quest for identity formation predicates the quest for knowledge in early adolescent students. In my experience, young teens are more likely to engage meaningfully in critical analysis of complex social structures when I lead their study through a point of entry with which they are already familiar and/or in which they see themselves. Without a relevant entry point, I often must oversimplify the object of study to make it more accessible for students, reducing my instruction to knowledge acquisition and thereby removing opportunities for students to practice critical thinking. Because of these issues, the 6-point framework is more developmentally appropriate for K-12 students. It is more likely they can articulate successfully the differences among beliefs, behaviors, and belonging because these concepts are more colloquial and therefore relevant to their personal lives. As Ben Marcus notes, the only way meaningful dialogue can take place is when two individuals discuss a subject in which they both have a vested interest. How can we expect meaningful dialogue to take place when students must employ interpretive categories they do not yet understand? Instead of expending limited instructional time to build an extensive preliminary foundation on various theories and methods in religious studies, a foundation that many K-12 teachers do not possess themselves, the 6-point framework allows K-12 teachers to develop religious literacy in their classrooms more quickly by building on students' background knowledge and interests. The 6-point framework teaches students how to analyze diverse, dynamic, and culturally embedded religious expressions of belief, behavior, and belonging. It approaches the academic study of religion from a linguistic perspective, where religion is like a language with multitudes of dialects, each dialect relying on distinct vocabularies mediated by culture, as Marcus writes. By taking a linguistic approach, K-12 classrooms promote religious literacy by honoring diversity and avoiding selective fluency. Although it is justifiable for religious communities to focus exclusively on religious beliefs and practices that are normative to their respective tradition, such is not the case in a public school setting. According to Marcus, K-12 teachers have a constitutional responsibility to avoid normativity, to analyze, not evaluate, the construction of religious language by deliberately teaching students how to recognize that religious individuals and communities express religion in a myriad of ways. This means K-12 teachers cannot overemphasize aspects of religious identity that are culturally or personally hegemonic. For example, although religious behavior plays a prominent role in Hindu religious identity by emphasizing the significance of religious practice, puja ceremonies, and the such, the 6-point framework reminds us that this is not the only area of religious identity formation. Other communities may place greater emphasis on religious beliefs or belonging. To prevent oversimplifying and/or distorting religious traditions, K-12 classrooms must avoid analyzing religious traditions through a hegemonic lens that privileges certain aspects of religious identity over others. The 6-point framework enables teachers to cultivate a neutral academic environment, to recognize the influences of both time and space on the cultural dynamism of religious identity. When students learn how to perform religious linguistic analysis through the lens of the 6-point framework, civic competency improves because they not only acquire deeper content knowledge, they also gain the ability to participate in meaningful, critically informed dialogue about religion and public life without marginalizing nor pathologizing minority voices. While the linguistic approach of the 6-point framework avoids selective religious literacy, it also supports deeper understanding of how a religious individual or community assigns values to the building blocks of their religion. As Marcus suggests, a linguistic understanding of religious languages will allow people to recognize how religious individuals communicate within their community and cultivate a deeper understanding of the constructed meanings and values of religious beliefs and practices in different communities. It is not enough to know the building blocks of religious vocabulary, such as the founders, texts, geography, sacred texts, key beliefs and rituals, used by an individual or a community. One must also learn the grammar by which they communicate the contextual and often contested meaning and value of this vocabulary. By utilizing the linguistic approach, Teachers can nurture students' abilities to describe, compare, and contrast religious identities and expressions within a religious community, between religious communities, and between religious and non-religious communities, without engaging in evaluation, indoctrination, or discrimination. In other words, classrooms that utilize the linguistic approach to teach students how to analyze various expressions of religious identity from an insider perspective without violating students' rights to free exercise of conscience. I recommend K through 12 public school teachers spend significant time breaking down the specific terminology of the 6-point framework, making sure to situate each of the 6 points within the context of the students' personal lives before asking them to apply these concepts elsewhere. Students might be able to identify what beliefs they hold, behaviors they exhibit, or communities to which they belong, but it is far more challenging for them to communicate how these beliefs, behaviors, and community experiences shape their personal identities. They likely have experienced or witnessed social institutions that are diverse, dynamic, and culturally embedded, but will struggle to explain why it is important or even interesting to recognize these features. If students cannot make these connections in their own lives, it's unlikely they will be able to make these connections in the religious lives of people living in the past or in distant lands, or even next door. To be clear, teachers should avoid asking students to describe and explain aspects of their personal religious identities, which could run the risk of violating students' constitutional rights. In order to maximize the efficacy of the 6-point framework in terms of both student achievement and administrative support, teachers need to examine their mandated social studies standards and identify potential areas where standards and framework overlap naturally. In the Kentucky Social Studies standards for grades 6 through 8, for example, those standards include 1, students will explain how elements of culture, e.g. language, the arts, customs, beliefs, literature, define specific groups and result in unique perspectives. And 2, students will compare how cultures develop social institutions such as family, religion, education, government, economy, to respond to human needs, structure society, and influence behavior. In 6th grade, these standards focus on groups and institutions in the present day. 7th grade focuses on early civilizations prior to 1500 CE, and 8th grade focuses on the United States prior to Reconstruction. Although the historical and geographic context of these standards differ across grade levels, the essential learning of these standards requires the same information and the skill set. Ideally, teachers would collaborate with the entire social studies department to analyze these standards, identify areas where they coincide with the 6-point framework, and then determine relevant learning goals that vertically align across grade levels. In addition to the religious studies, an additional resource is the religious studies supplement to the C3 framework, which includes a set of secondary level religious literacy standards that integrate the 6-point framework. The C3 framework opens accessibility to the academic study of religion for high school classrooms because it systematically addresses the development and formation of religious identity in individuals and communities. It utilizes the language and structure of education standards with which teachers are already familiar, thus reducing the learning curve for teachers who are not familiar with the academic study of religion. Finally, some resources teachers might use do not directly address religious literacy and therefore may require some additional modifications in order to meet particular learning goals. One such resource is Facing History and Ourselves, which includes multiple units across grade levels that investigate issues related to identity and community from a more secular position. These resources could easily be modified and or supplemented to address the concepts of the 6-point framework more directly. Another resource I have found useful in teaching American history has been reading, teaching, and writing about history, teaching argument writing to diverse learners in Common Core classrooms grades 6 through 12. This guide provides a concrete method for teaching students how to analyze primary sources and write argumentative essays about debatable historical questions. It includes clear research-based rationale that also anticipates potential student misconceptions and learning hurdles. In addition, it provides all relevant instructional materials, differentiated text sets, graphic organizers, assessments, student work exemplars, rubrics, and progress charts. Even with expert content knowledge, novice teachers, especially those in low-achieving schools, need this level of support because they lack expertise in teaching to develop their own instructional materials. Their workdays often are consumed with classroom management issues, so they do not have the time, energy, nor ability to develop sound instructional materials from scratch. As a result, novice teachers often rely primarily on textbooks, YouTube videos, and PowerPoint presentations to communicate course content. While these resources do not directly address the learning goals of religious studies, these instructional tools could serve as models for curriculum development by professional organizations, such as UBROI, that are better equipped to develop materials that align more closely with the objectives of religious literacy education. Thank you so much, and I will now take questions.
Okay. Other questions?
Yes.
Jerry has a question.
Yes.
Can you hear him?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Yes.
Great. An associated question about bringing religion or religious history into the classroom is bringing meditation into the classroom. Have you ever done that? And are the rules the same?
It really depends on what the individual state and district mandates allow teachers to do. So in Kentucky, there has been a collective of schools that have implemented meditation from a very scientific, more definitely removed of its cultural history. The teachers I've spoken with say that they teach breathing exercises, they teach centering and mind and body control, but they do not discuss the religious and cultural origins of these practices. I have mixed feelings about that. On the one hand, should they discuss those, it would be teetering endorsement of religious traditions, which would be a constitutional violation of the First Amendment. But then also to completely exclude that from the discussion lends itself to almost cultural appropriation. Finding that balance is very challenging, and I think that conversations among educators of how can we find a way to create that balance in a way that honors the cultures and religions that these practices come from, but does not alienate students who do not share those beliefs, that does not threaten parents or administrators who feel like they are having things imposed upon them. It's a very sticky situation, and so I think my district has decided to go with the sanitized route and not bring any cultural aspects to that, and I would like to get to a point where we can balance that better.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can I?
Yeah, Professor M.G. Prasad has a
Yeah.
question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, very interesting topic in terms of religion, because we have always been thinking religion and school education, have some issues. When you have the 6-point thing, when you teach several religions, the beliefs, the belief of one religion is totally opposite to the beliefs of other religions. What does the student would get, and how does the teaching goes on in that direction?
So in that context, I would emphasize that we want to understand the diversity. We want to embrace the contradictions, and we are not here to evaluate or judge those contradictions. We're not here to have a discussion of this one is right and this one is wrong. in a public school setting in America, that is an inappropriate conversation that should be left at the home of the family and not in the public school, or in their particular religious institution. So we would avoid a kind of evaluative discussion of, well, this one's right and this one's wrong, or this one's better and this one's worse. We would just kind of lay out all the facts and look to see where are there points of discord, but then where are there points of harmony? Where are there moments where these traditions, these beliefs and practices seem to be completely opposed, and yet where are there points where they are more aligned and more parallel with each other? And so it's not up to me as the teacher to, and again, this is coming from an American public schools from experience. It is not up to me as a teacher to guide the student to make a particular evaluation. It is up to me to provide them with the full spread of information and provide them with the tools necessary to make those decisions, but I cannot influence those decisions whatsoever. So this is why specific training in religious literacy is essential, because that's a very nuanced teaching endeavors. How do I teach a child to evaluate without telling them what to evaluate, or what the right way of thinking? And so I would like to see more programs such as this, where educators can receive tools necessary to help students come to these conclusions on their own.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, I have a question, Kelly. It's very interesting the way you present, put in some kind of framework and discuss everything, which you brought language, maybe teach in terms of language or teach in terms of skills. But we are talking here of some educational pedagogy which happens to belong to certain area of the geographical area, and we want to make it effective. So here's, for example, mathematical discussion. You probably heard about mathematics.
Yes.
So then,
That was great.
so then how? I mean, you have heard, I think, maybe that before also when you were here. Maybe Swati was here most likely. So now, how do you? Obviously, you can just teach the steps and say, well, just after that, wash your hands. Say that this is something that or you tell them that it has a history, it has culture in various places, of different types. How do you include that? Or more broad, let's say, for example, Sanskrit is a language, and you teach a language, then of course there is a lot of literature that goes with it. Some of that may definitely have cultural or philosophical connection. I don't know about the religious, that really is a little bit of subjective. How do you deal with that?
I guess I will go back to what I was describing in my talk as teaching students what's called an insider perspective. So it's teaching them to kind of bracket their own experiences and look at beliefs and traditions from the perspective of someone who holds them to be good and true and right. But that does not require the student to also accept that they are good and true and right. So I definitely say it's a more complex level of thinking. It's definitely more metacognitive than what most public schools are engaged in right now. And so to suggest that seems very vague and like, what does that even look like? Because this is such a new field. The academic study of religion on the university level really only has existed in the past 100, 150 years. And then in K-12 public schools, really, it didn't start, I would say, until the 1990s. And so we're still trying to navigate how to effectively teach kids about religious ideas without sanitizing it and making it so that they can see things from the perspective of those who believe it. Because that's the skill ultimately I think that I want my students to have. Is I don't want them to pick a particular religion or to agree with a certain view. I just want them to be able to see where someone else is coming from. And that is a skill that you're not born with. It has to be taught, it has to be cultivated, it has to be practiced consistently and deliberately. And I think that in American culture, we kind of just take it for granted that the insider perspective is what creates peace and harmony among different groups of people who are so different.